Episode 14, The Peace of Pius, 140 to 149 AD. Hello and welcome back to 202 Decades. Last time, we saw Hadrian suffer from failure. The failure of his love for Antoninus, the failure to create a Hellenistic peace across his empire, the failure of his first succession plan, and the failure of his own health. His original pick for the succession died before Hadrian himself was dead. In his place, he chose the 51-year-old Titus Aurelius Antoninus to be his successor, with the condition that he adopt Lucius Verus, the young son of Hadrian's first pick and Marcus Aurelius, Antoninus' nephew. Most consider Marcus to be Hadrian's ultimate goal for the succession, with Antoninus serving as a stable bridge until he was old enough to rule on his own. This wasn't expected to take long. Antoninus was not a young man. Hadrian probably expected him to rule for a decade or so before passing the empire onto Marcus in his mid-30s. But Antoninus lived and reigned far longer than anyone expected. And for the people of the empire, that was a good thing. The reign of Antoninus Pius was perhaps the high point of the empire's prosperity, a bright, white beacon of light before the coming darkness. The end of the Pax Romana draws near, but, like Antoninus, we will not trouble ourselves with tomorrow's worries just yet. For now, let's bask in the light and dive into the 140s. Here's what we're covering this time. Part 1. Pius. Part 2, the Antonine Wall. Part 3, ripples on a still pond. Part 4, conservation. Part 1, Pius. Hadrian died at his villa in July of 138. While Antoninus hurried along the construction of Hadrian's grand mausoleum in Rome, his remains remained at his villa. As I explained last time, one of Antoninus' first actions upon Hadrian's death was to ask the Senate to deify his predecessor. The Senate, who had no intention of deifying the self-important and murderous Hadrian, balked at the suggestion. Especially coming from Antoninus, a longtime senator who they counted as one of their own. But Antoninus, who was now legally the son of Hadrian, was intent on honoring his legal father. The Senate was aghast. They resisted his request until Antoninus threatened to resign his post. Begrudgingly, the Senate relented. They liked Antoninus and feared a power vacuum more than they despised Hadrian. Hadrian was granted divinity. For this dutiful appeal, Antoninus was given the title Pius. This interaction was emblematic of the relationship the Senate would have with Antoninus. They were at first obstinate of his request, but the humble manner in which he had come to them was far different from how Hadrian had treated them. Their relationship would be a close one. Antoninus sought to uplift the Senate and honor them at every opportunity. In 139, Hadrian's mausoleum was completed. Antoninus rode beside his divine father's remains as they were brought back to Rome and interred there. The mausoleum of Hadrian still stands today in Rome on the right bank of the Tiber, less than a kilometer from the Vatican. A fort has since been built around it, and today it is called Castel Sant'Angelo. The honor Antoninus showed Hadrian wasn't endless, though. Soon after the death, Antoninus rearranged the marriage planned for young Marcus Aurelius, his newly adopted son. Hadrian had arranged a marriage between Marcus and Sionia Fabia, the older sister of Lucius. But Antoninus broke this off and had Marcus engaged to marry his own daughter, Faustina the Younger. Yes, they were legally siblings, not to mention actual cousins, but despite Roman legal fictions, there wasn't any uproar about the marriage of Marcus and Faustina. As we get into the happenings of the 140s, let's get to know Antoninus Pius a little better. We'll be hanging with him for all of this decade and next. One quick note about the series before I go on. This show has been a little more emperor-focused than I would prefer over the last few decades. That's mostly due to a narrowing of source material. Our most detailed sources, what few we have, are mostly a description of the emperor's actions. Archaeology is able to fill in many gaps, but does a poorer job forming a narrative. I'll do my best to keep the focus on broader history and not merely a series of biographies. That task should get easier as chaos grows and other political states enter the picture in the coming centuries. Anyway, back to Antoninus, for whom I will give a brief biography doing just about the opposite of what I just said. He was born in 86 AD, and like Hadrian and Trajan, he was from a provincial family. They from Hispania, he from the province of Narbonensis, in what's now southern France. The family was from Nîmes, what was then called Numasis. Although his family was from there, and had created their fortune there, Antoninus himself was born about 20 miles southeast of Rome at a family estate. His father served as consul under Domitian in 89, but died soon after. He was an only child, and after his father's death, he was raised by his grandfather, who was a friend of Pliny the Younger. As a side note, I'm now committed to mentioning Pliny in as many episodes as possible. Antoninus rose through the cursus honorum, the traditional path of offices for promising young senators. Although not overly ambitious, he must have displayed a certain competence which kept him advancing. In 120, he reached the peak when he served as consul. But following this post, he retired to his villa for some time. Hadrian wouldn't let him stay there. When Italy was split into 4 provinces, Antoninus was put in charge of Etruria, where many of his family's estates were located. Despite the split being unpopular to everyone except Hadrian, Antoninus served well in this role. He gained favor with Hadrian, the Senate, and the people. In 133, he was given the most prestigious governorship, the province of Asia, with its many large, wealthy cities. He continued to network and earn honor for himself in this role. When he returned to Rome, he fell in with the newly returned Hadrian and entered his inner circle. Antoninus had married his wife, Faustina, by no later than 115. Unusual for Roman emperors, the two were thought to have had a happy marriage. Together, they had 4 children. 3 of them died before Antoninus became emperor. The 4th, Faustina the Younger, as I mentioned earlier, married Marcus. Faustina the Elder grew sick in 140 and died in late October. Antoninus was crushed by her death. He honored her with Senate-approved deification and the construction of the Temple of Faustina on the Forum. Antoninus never remarried, although he did later take Galeria Lysistrate, a freed slave of Faustina, as his companion. Not remarrying avoided complicating the inheritance. That inheritance would go to his surviving children, adopted and natural. Those heirs were Faustina and Marcus, now married, and Lucius. As heirs to the principate, Marcus and Lucius required a skilled tutor. Antoninus searched around and decided on Marcus Cornelius Fronto, a man of Berber origin from Sirta in the province of Africa. Already living in Rome at this time, he had gained a reputation as a philosopher and a rhetorician, second only to Cicero himself. In 140, Antoninus served as consul for the 3rd time, and with the Senate's prompting, he chose Marcus Aurelius, now 19 years old, as his partner. A little on-the-job training and significant honor for someone so young. As this decade and the next go by, keep the maturation of Marcus and Lucius in the back of your mind. The two will become emperors. All that occurred, or didn't, during the reign of Antoninus gives us context to their formation. The stability of a country can, to a significant degree, be attributed to competent and stable rulers at the highest level of government. For Rome, that meant the princeps, the emperor. Although Hadrian had left Antoninus a peaceful and prospering empire to govern, a more erratic ruler could have easily derailed things. We saw this with the reign of Nero. The first 5 years of his rule, while his advisors still steered the ship of state, was long remembered for its goodness. But when Nero erratically began to make decisions, enemies, outside and inside the empire, took notice and broke the peace. What resulted was the only period of anarchy since Augustus, the year of the 4 emperors. Antoninus was no Nero, though. His character ensured peace would reign as long as he did. Marcus Aurelius, in his Meditations, harkens back to his memory of Antoninus. He says, "Remember his constancy in every reasonable act, his evenness in all things, his piety and the serenity of his countenance, and his disregard for empty fame. Do everything," he instructed himself, "as a disciple of Antoninus." Antoninus was pious to the old gods, yet tolerant, gentle yet resolute, austere yet generous. Perhaps the highest praise comes from the Historia Augusta, which says, "He cared for all men and all things as his own." Part 2. The Antonine Wall. Antoninus emulated Hadrian's mission of peace. He avoided starting any conflicts, with one notable exception. He began a military campaign in Britannia. Some kind of trouble had broken out there in 138 or 139, perhaps involving the powerful Brigantes tribe. The sources aren't in agreement here, but the Brigantes had plenty of incentive to revolt. Their ancestral lands were bisected by Hadrian's wall. They must have grown tired of being watched, counted, and taxed as they passed back and forth through the wall's gates. The extent of the conflict isn't clear either. All we can say for sure is that it was severe enough that a competent and experienced governor was appointed, named Quintus Lollius Urbicus. He was yet another Berber with experience suppressing the Bar Kokhba revolt in Judea, and having served as governor of Asia prior to this post. Urbicus quieted the disturbances along the wall, and by 140 he had refurbished a fort a couple miles south of the wall called Corbridge. The campaign could have ended here, but Antoninus prompted his new governor to take the fight across the wall. This was an opportunity for Antoninus to earn the title Imperator, even if he was not personally present to lead. Under the emperor's guiding, Urbicus launched an invasion of the Caledonian lowlands to the north of the wall. He took the island's 3 legions with him. Next to nothing can be said in detail about the campaign. Archaeology shows there was likely a siege of a major Caledonian fort at Burnswork Hill, about 12 miles northwest of the wall. Hundreds of lead sling bullets have been found at the site, along with the remains of 2 Roman camps. After crushing the locals here, Urbicus's army built a fort at Blatobulgium with a large victory inscription dedicated to Antoninus. Over the next year, Urbicus and his army battled and subdued the local tribes. It must have been felt that his pacification of the lowlands was complete by 142. That year, Antoninus further emulated his predecessor by ordering the construction of a new wall, the Antonine Wall, to mark the new northern boundary. This was a turf wall with stone foundations. It was about half as long as Hadrian's Wall, only needing to stretch 39 miles across the neck of land between the Firth of Forth and the Firth of Clyde. The wall was less imposing than Hadrian's Wall, but still impressive. It rose 3 meters high and featured a large ditch in front of it. A military road ran just south of the wall, connecting the 19 forts which guarded it. Several coastal forts supported the wall on each end. To staff the new wall and new forts, the guard at Hadrian's Wall was reduced. A few centuries later, Bede the Venerable, the Anglo-Saxon monk and historian who, if you remember back to the 120s, misattributed Hadrian's Wall, also misattributed the Antonine Wall. This time he assumed the British tribes had built it. During the later medieval period, the wall became known as Grim's Dyke, and later Graham's Dyke, which seems to have been named after a 5th century Scot who broke through the wall with his men. Today, remains of the wall can still be seen in Scotland, but there's much less to see than at Hadrian's Wall. It would be convenient to continue the story of the Antonine Wall and the interbellum lands to their near future end, but what's the fun in breaking the series format? For now, for this decade, let's leave Urbicus, Antoninus, and the Romans in victory. New lands had been conquered for the glory of Rome. More than anything, the campaign and the wall were public relations victories for Antoninus, freeing him to accept the title of Imperator and receive an imperial salutation, an honor just below a triumph for the conquest. Part 3. Ripples on a Still Pond. The title of Imperator, Conqueror, would not be one Antoninus would have much use for during his reign. He ruled in peace. In fact, the reign of Antoninus was considered the most peaceful reign in the history of the Principate. In the ancient heart of Rome stood the old temple to Janus, the two-faced god of beginnings and ends. Tradition says that the second king of Rome, Numa Pompilius, had built the temple and begun the ritual of opening the doors to the temple during times of war and closing them during times of peace. During the reign of Antoninus, moss must have started to grow over the doors to the temple of Janus. They remained closed throughout his 23 years as princeps. That's not to say nothing happened across the empire. Plenty of things happened. Arts and culture flourished under his peace. The peace of Antoninus was not one without revolts. They were just small in scale and easily dealt with. A Greek orator and author named Aelius Aristides, who lived during Antoninus' reign, says, "Wars, even if they once occurred, no longer seem to have been real. On the contrary, stories about them are interpreted more as myths by the many who hear them. If anywhere an actual clash occurs along the border, as is only natural in the immensity of a great empire, then, simply like myths, they themselves quickly pass." The disturbances in Britannia we have just mentioned. Antoninus had dealt with those troubles by conquering new lands and building his wall. Far to the south, the citizens of Mauritania were dealing with a problem which Hadrian thought he had solved. Berbers were again raiding from the highlands and arid regions into the fertile lowlands near the Mediterranean. Antoninus appointed a new governor, shipped in cavalry from Pannonia, and fortified several at-risk cities. The attacks were slowed, but not stopped, like smacking wasps out of the air, but not addressing the hive itself. There were also small disturbances in Judea and in Lower Dacia, but nothing that the histories felt warranted elaborating on. These were promptly dealt with, and peace restored. Tensions were building all along the northern frontier of the empire. In Dacia, elsewhere along the Danube, and along the Rhine, where minor incursions of Germans were swiftly dealt with. There's archaeological evidence of improvements to roads here, as well as further investments in the limes, which Domitian and Hadrian had begun. Like in Mauritania, immediate threats were dealt with, defenses improved, but the problems were not traced back to their sources and defeated. We also get reports of trouble in an area of the Roman world I don't think I've talked about so far in this series. Apparently, there were Scythian attacks on Olbia, a city on the north coast of the Black Sea, in modern Ukraine, near the Crimea. Olbia was one of dozens of old Greek colonies which had been planted around the Black Sea, beginning in the 7th century BC. Several of these cities, mostly on the Crimea and nearby on the Sea of Azov, a mini bonus sea northeast of the main body of the Black Sea. Several of these cities became united in a kingdom around 480 BC. This kingdom in modern Ukraine, Russia, and the land they're currently fighting over was called the Bosporan Kingdom, or the Kingdom of the Cimmerian Bosporus. Rather confusingly, not too far away on the other side of the Black Sea is the Bosphorus. Bosphorus and Bosporan sound and look similar, so be careful not to confuse the two. Anyway, the Bosporan kingdom was independent for centuries before coming under the control of the Pontic Empire, an Eastern Greek kingdom that under Mithridates gave the Romans repeated trouble in Anatolia and Greece. That's all a blast from the past. Since the Roman defeat of Pontus by Pompey in 63 BC, Rome had controlled the Bosporan kingdom as a client state. Under Roman rule, the far-off cities had flourished as centers of export trade. They traded wheat, fish, amber, and slaves, and grew wealthy. The Bosporan kingdom turned out to be Rome's longest-lived client kingdom, perhaps too remote to be worth fully integrating. This was Rome's primary interface with the nomads of the Eurasian steppe. These people, who were just called Scythians to the Romans, could be valuable trade partners or dangerous neighbors. Under Vespasian, a fort was built at a site called Charax. Soldiers were garrisoned there to protect the cities nearby. Okay, so the city I began this discussion by mentioning, Olbia, technically wasn't part of the Bosporan kingdom, but it was nearby. It was actually grouped with Lower Moesia, though geographically isolated from the rest of the province. I just wanted to take the rare opportunity to highlight this far outpost of the Roman world. Like the disturbances elsewhere, the Scythian attack on Olbia was not a major event. The town was raided, Marines were called in to salvage the situation, and the town, though damaged, was rebuilt and fortified. A ripple on the pond that faded back into stillness. When the Parthians appeared to be preparing to attack into Armenia, Antoninus sent the King of Kings a letter that just said, "Don't." And the Parthians backed down. Okay, maybe the letter didn't have just a single word. But despite his reputation for peace, Antoninus made it clear he would forcefully respond and make them pay if the Parthians attacked. The Parthians, still remembering the thrashing they took under Trajan, backed down. They had nearly tossed a boulder into the pond of peace, but Antoninus' word had checked them. Apparently, not everyone in the empire was enjoying a decade of tranquility. The Historia Augusta records 2 usurpation attempts. Both were senators who seemed to have wanted a shot as princeps. At least one of them had hoped that he would be Hadrian's choice for heir. With this ambition disappointed, he plotted against Antoninus. But his plans were discovered, and he was sentenced to death by the Senate. In his justice, Antoninus forbid reprisals against the plotters' families. That attempts at rebellion were so meager that the Senate did not latch on to these attempts indicates how popular a ruler Antoninus had become. The Senate was perfectly content reclining in their pleasure boats on the pond of Antoninus' peace. Part 4. Conservation. As I said in the intro, the reign of Antoninus was perhaps the high point of the Pax Romana, when all seemed right in the world. Because of this peace and stability, little was recorded of historical note. Of course, cultural production continued and flourished, but change on a societal and political level slowed. A long moment where the noonday sun hung straight above the earth before the shadows began to grow again. If you read an account of Antoninus' reign during the 140s, you'll repeatedly read words and phrases bearing a common theme. Mild, no great dramas, no dramatic changes, continuing tradition, stability, maintenance, frugality, evenness in all things, modest, most peaceful, etc., etc. Above all else, Antoninus was a conservative. He was not an innovator, but a preserver. This applied to policies, but also to people. Rome's distrust of kings ran deep, hence the 2 consuls and their single year in office. Governors and other administrators generally served only short terms as well. Few served in any office for more than a few years at a time. There were exceptions, like Agricola serving 8 years as governor of Britain, but they were notable because they were exceptional. These short terms introduced at least two major flaws into the Roman government. First, short terms didn't give the administrators long enough to understand or become skilled in their position. By the time the governor of a province had really gotten to know the needs and trouble spots of his province, it was time to pack up and head back to Rome. Second, these short terms removed accountability and encouraged short-term thinking. Administrators could fleece their constituents and practice corruption and be out of office before the consequences caught up to them. Antoninus was exceptional in allowing members of his bureaucracy to remain in place for longer periods of time. This would be beneficial to the provinces if someone competent was in place, and harmful if someone corrupt was in place. But Antoninus was a just ruler. He worked hard to ensure those holding office were extensions of his justice, his fairness, and his benevolence. One example of an exceptionally long reign was Marcus Gavius Maximus, who served as Praetorian prefect for 20 years. Antoninus was in some ways an innovator in his conservatism. Apart from extending office terms, he also flat out kept Hadrian's bureaucracy in place. The Historia Augusta says, "He removed none of the men whom Hadrian had appointed to office, and, indeed, was so steadfast and loyal that he retained good men in the government of provinces for terms of 7 and even 9 years." If it was working well under Hadrian, why shake things up? This was a departure from just about all of his predecessors, though, who, for the most part, started their court and their bureaucracy from scratch. For Antoninus, continuity was the theme. If you picked up anything from the decades run by Hadrian, it was hopefully a turning of the focus of the empire from Rome and Italy to the provinces. Although he was also from a provincial family, just like Hadrian and Trajan, Antoninus preferred to select thoroughly Italian men to serve. The reign of Antoninus, then, was a last hurrah of Italian-led government. 23 years of nostalgia. Not only was Antoninus the opposite of Hadrian when it came to innovation, a lot for Hadrian, very little for Antoninus, but also when it came to travel. Hadrian traveled a lot. Antoninus, on the other hand, never left Italy during his reign. He, in the model of Trajan, relied on delegating to leaders in the provinces, corresponding by letter, not personal presence. Antoninus was also a fiscal conservative. I'm using modern terms here, but try to imagine the most basic application of those terms. Whenever possible, he was a saver, not a spender. His splendor as a saver was something to savor. He was careful with state finances, always keeping a close eye on the money coming in and money going out to the legions, public works, alimenta programs, and the grain dole. He was careful, but not stingy. With the long peace of the past couple of decades, the provinces were flourishing and revenue was quick to fill the treasury. So although he did not splurge to the degree of Hadrian, Antoninus completed many of Hadrian's projects and began many, but fewer, of his own. His administration focused on more functional construction and fewer grand temples. He built many aqueducts across the empire and improved roads. The mile markers he ordered are among the most prolific remnants of his reign. While he was less liberal with state funds than his predecessors, no one could call him a miser. Antoninus, upon becoming emperor, was extremely generous with his own substantial resources. During a famine, he used his own money to provide the people with wine and oil. He loaned money out at a rate of 4%, the lowest rate ever exacted, says the Historia Augusta. The provinces were thriving under his light hand, for while he was cautious in spending, he was open-handed and forgiving in collecting from the provinces. Under his careful watch, corruption receded to a nadir. He knew the finances of his provinces well. He was also generous to provinces hit by disaster. In the year 140, an earthquake destroyed much of the Greek island of Rhodes. In response, he canceled taxes there and nearby, allowing the survivors to get their feet back under themselves. For all his penny pinching, Antoninus wasn't too cheap to host public games. He allowed games to be held on his birthday every year. Of particular interest to him were massive animal hunts. The year 147 brought with it an occasion for special celebration. This was the 900th anniversary of the founding of Rome, 900 years since Romulus and Remus had founded the city in 753 BC. Hundreds of exotic animals, such as giraffes, rhinos, tigers, lions, crocodiles, and elephants, fought each other and gladiators in the Colosseum. If only Romulus could see his city now. The year 147 also saw the birth of Marcus Aurelius' first child, a daughter. This made Antoninus a grandfather. Marcus was honored by being granted fuller imperial powers. Antoninus was not a young man. He was 61 in the year 147. With death right around the corner, it was thought, many may have assumed Marcus would soon ascend even further, to become princeps himself. But, as we'll see next decade, Antoninus wasn't going anywhere soon. You might expect the young Caesar-in-waiting to be impatient for his turn at the top, but this wasn't the case with Marcus Aurelius. He was content to continue his education, continue his philosophy, and slowly take on more and more responsibilities. In his Meditations, we find Marcus struggling to reconcile that virtuous life of philosophy with his duties. Fortunately for him, Antoninus was not done ruling just yet. Like Marcus, let us be content with the peaceful, prosperous zenith of the Roman peace decade. Let us not rush on to the troubles ahead. We end this decade here, reclining beside the still pond of peace. Next decade, we get more peace and more pious. I'll see you next time.